Hello everyone. The famous British RMS Titanic sank in the North Atlantic Ocean in 1912. More than 100 years later, people still can't solve all the mysteries of the disaster. One of the mysteries that keeps puzzling everyone is what happened to the bodies. Today, we'll try to find the answer to that question. Let's get it on. At the beginning of the 20th century, traveling across the Atlantic was a common but risky business. The two biggest cruise ship companies, Cunard Line and White Star Line, were in constant rivalry. In 1907, the Cunard Line launched the Mauretania and Lusitania liners, the largest ships in the world at that time. They reached speeds of up to 25 knots, that is 46 kilometers per hour. Such speed allowed these ships to cross the Atlantic in just 5 days. The fast and reliable liners of their main rivals meant that White Star Line's profits were seriously affected, but the company didn't give up, and they decided to build two superliners, maybe not as fast as those of their rivals, but more comfortable and larger. They planned to launch the Olympic liner first and the Titanic 10 months later. The steel of the highest grade was used for the construction of the Titanic, according to the industry standards. However, these steel sheets had a small defect before mounting. The rivet holes were cold punched prior to riveting, which resulted in micro cracks. The sheets were fastened with 3 rows of steel and rivets made of low-quality iron. About 1,500 people worked on the construction of the Titanic, and on May 31st, 1911, the liner was launched in front of numerous spectators. At first, the Titanic wasn't going to be different from the Olympic, but soon it was upgraded. For example, some drawbacks were fixed, more cabins were added, as well as a hall for the first-class receptions and so on. It turned out to be an unmatched vessel. The Titanic could reach speeds of up to 42 kilometers per hour. The Shipbuilder magazine called the Titanic virtually unsinkable because of the special double-bottom design. The first-class passenger cabins were stunningly luxurious as well. They were decorated in various styles, richly adorned with mahogany, stained glass windows, silk and gilding. Also, first-class passengers had access to a swimming pool, a squash court, a restaurant, 2 cafes, a gymnasium. The second class was a little less comfortable, but even these simply arranged third-class cabins were very comfortable. Moreover, each passenger could enjoy the delicious meals, so some of them were living in even better conditions than at home. The Titanic was a genuine luxury hotel of the early 20th century, which in addition could take its guests to New York in just a few days. Sadly, the magnificent liner didn't bring success to the White Star Line. On April 10th, 1912, the Titanic left Southampton for New York on its first and only cruise. It was carrying 1,317 passengers and 908 crew members. On April 14th, 1912, the Titanic received 6 messages from other vessels warning of a large amount of drifting ice. Even the passengers noticed it. That day, the ice conditions in the North Atlantic were the worst they'd been in 50 years. The first message was received at 9 in the morning, and Captain Smith ordered a slight change of course to avoid collision. However, the rest of the warnings didn't reach the bridge deck, since the radio mostly transmitted the passengers' messages. Besides, on that day, the equipment broke down, delaying the messages and making the operators nervous. Perhaps they ignored the warnings about the ice, considering them unimportant. But don't blame the whole catastrophe on them. The crew members were aware that there was ice in the area, but didn't slow the ship down. At the time, the liner's crews were mostly focused on keeping up with the schedule. They had to arrive at the port on time. They saw danger warnings as recommendations, not calls to action. And after all, the Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable, so why would it feel threatened by just a piece of ice? If other ships could survive a collision with an iceberg, the Titanic would definitely be able to keep going. And boy, were they wrong. On April 14th at 11:39 p.m., a lookout reported an iceberg on the course to the command bridge. The crew tried to avoid a collision by making a turn, but the ship just lost speed. According to some reports, that's why the damage caused by the iceberg was so huge. The collision resulted in a hole in the liner. and water immediately began to enter the ship at a rate of 7.1 tons per second, 15 times faster than it could have been pumped out. Researchers believe an error in the liner's construction was one of the reasons for such serious damage. Cold water also increased the cracks that had appeared during the rivet's installation, making the metal too brittle. But the Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable for a reason. It was designed to stay afloat, even if 4 of its lower compartments were flooded. But the icy water filled 5 compartments that night, and the ship began to sink. The Titanic was doomed. By the way, another version suggests that the main problem wasn't an iceberg, but a fire in the hold. According to this theory, a pile of coal spontaneously caught fire in one of the ship's coal vaults. The fire spread to the whole hold, reached the steam boilers, which then exploded, causing the ship to sink. And the iceberg, it was just there. In fact, there was indeed a fire on the Titanic, but that was pretty common at the time. In this case, coal does not burn, but just quietly smolders, sometimes for days. So it is unlikely that this could have been the reason for the sinking of the Titanic. On April the 15th at 5 past midnight, Captain Smith ordered to prepare the lifeboats and gather the passengers. There was no PA system, so the crew had to wake every passenger on board. Stewards from the first class helped passengers to get dressed and even took them to the deck, while for the second and third class passengers it was way more difficult. There were more passengers than personnel, so the stewards simply threw the doors open, telling them to get on deck. No one even mentioned the ship was sinking. Many passengers were reluctant to leave their cabins or just refused to believe anything was happening. Around 1:15 midnight, the stewards began ordering the passengers to put on their life belts, although many took it as a joke again. Some even took ice pieces scattered across the deck to play football. In total, the Titanic had only 20 lifeboats that could accommodate up to 68 people each, but there were many more passengers on board. But it wasn't about saving money though. The company was able to afford additional boats, and there was definitely room for them. The thing is that at the time, lifeboats were used to transport passengers from a sinking ship to another ship, so it was common for liners to have fewer lifeboats on board than they actually needed. In addition, the White Star Line wanted the ship to have a wide deck to enjoy the view. Spare lifeboats would definitely ruin that view. Things were about to get chaotic on the ship.
Stay back! Stay back! The line! Stay back!
While Captain Smith was an experienced sailor, it was his first shipwreck, and he went numb, as survivors say. The crew wasn't ready for emergencies either. Most of them weren't even sailors. When Smith commanded the evacuation of the women and children, the 2 officers in charge took his words differently. One of them first seated the women and children in the boats, and the other didn't let anyone else in. That's why some of the boats were half empty. If it weren't for this misunderstanding, at least 500 more people could have been saved. In addition, some passengers simply refused to board the boats. They considered it much safer to be on board the liner than in a small boat. As a result, more than 1,000 passengers and crew members were still on board when the Titanic sank. Almost all those who jumped or fell into the water either drowned or died within minutes due to cold shock and hypothermia. It took an hour and a half before the RMS Carpathia arrived to take all the survivors aboard. But what happened to the poor people who stayed in the icy water? The White Star Line allocated several ships to lift the bodies and the Titanic wreckage. In 2 weeks, the CS Mackay Bennett crew found and retrieved 306 bodies, but they quickly ran out of embalming agents. According to sanitary regulations, only embalmed bodies could be delivered to the port, so the captain of the Mackay Bennett decided to leave many third-class passengers and crew members in the ocean. Also, some bodies were so damaged that it was impossible to identify them. Other vessels did the same, collecting a total of 328 bodies from the ocean. After that, some ships came across the remains of passengers of the Titanic. They were carried to the northeast and dispersed across a large area by the Gulf Stream. As a result, by June, only 333 bodies out of 1,500 victims of the sinking Titanic were found. It was decided not to search for the rest, as it would be impossible to identify them. But the victims' relatives demanded to keep looking. They insisted on finding the remains of the Titanic and lifting them from the bottom. Firstly, the deceased deserved a proper burial, and secondly, well, many jewels have gone under the water with the people, but finding the wreck turned out to be a difficult, almost impossible task. Only in 1985, a joint American-French expedition led by Robert Ballard found the wreckage of the Titanic. It was believed that most of the bodies were on the ship because there were not enough boats, and a few passengers dared to jump into the icy water, but instead of human remains, they discovered many shoes. In other words, there were once bodies here, but they decomposed completely over time. They just simply vanished. There is still no consensus among experts as to whether the human remains could have been preserved on the Titanic. Some researchers claim to have stumbled upon them, but we will never know the real answer to this question because the liner itself is gradually collapsing. Most likely by 2037, there will be nothing left of the Titanic. Hey, stop being lazy, it's time to use that brain of yours. Welcome to Brain Time. Incredible facts from the past, the present, and even the future. The power of nature and wild animals, amazing facts and unsolved mysteries. You'll find all this and much more here. Subscribe now, you won't regret it.